Eric Ward is the executive director of the Western States Center and the Western State Strategy and Western State Strategies, as well as a close friend of mine. Eric is also a leading civil rights strategist and an expert on hate movements and what it takes to defend democratic institutions and inclusive societies. Eric, I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to just get right into it and start with a question.
Thanks, Maurice.
So my first question, and thanks, Eric, for joining us, is since the start of the Trump administration, we've seen these white nationalist and white supremacist movements really organizing in ways that I at least have, but in reality, I know these movements have always existed. And so could you tell us a little bit more about this history? Where does all of this come from?
Thanks so much, and it's wonderful to be here with all the supporters of the Working Families Party this evening. Though, interesting enough, the white nationalist movement, and when we say white nationalist, I want to just identify for a second, we're not talking about the system of white supremacy that has existed pre-existing the United States. White supremacy that was grounded in chattel slavery and the stolen resources and lands of Native people and the control of women's sexuality. White nationalism is a social movement, as white supremacy is a historic and present-day system of exploitation and disparity. The white nationalist movement, interesting enough, comes out of the success of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. If we remember, white supremacy is the rule of law in pre-existing 1968. It is how culture and economy is defined. It's not debated. It's just how people see the world. Now comes along the civil rights movement made up primarily of African Americans and other allies who defeat white supremacy, the idea that white people are superior. So imagine you believe in Jim Crow, you believe in separate but equal, but all of a sudden now you've lost to folks you have thought of as inferior all your life. How do you explain it? And it's in the explanation that white nationalism begins to take root. White nationalism tells itself that it didn't lose to Black people. And it says this so that it can create and maintain the idea of white superiority. It answers instead that it lost to a global Jewish conspiracy. It takes on anti-Semitism along with its historic racism. It sets itself apart from existing white supremacy. It sees itself as at war with the United States of America. But we should be clear, in their view, what they are at war at is the idea of a multicultural, multiracial democracy that is people-centered, accountable, and transparent. Maurice, I would say this. We should understand that the white nationalist movement seeks to create an ethnic state, a white-only ethno-state. It seeks to free itself of people of color and Jews altogether. It is a social movement, it is on the rise, and it is beginning to have an impact, as you laid out, in public policy. If white supremacy is a system, white nationalism is the social movement that seeks to take control of the state in order to rid itself of all kinds of people of color through assaulting what we have of a democratic system in America.
Thanks, Eric. I really appreciate that sort of historical context, because I think a lot of us are sort of seeing these outgrowths of these organizations and this terrorist attack sort of out of context, and it's been really demoralizing and really traumatizing for people. So providing that historical context, I think, is so helpful to understand the roots of this. Now, my other question is just plainly, what do we do? What may we do in order to stop them? As you said, they're on the rise.
So it is a social movement that's on the rise, and I think that it calls for a re-examination. And what I mean by that is that typically those of us who have challenged economic and racial and gender inequality in our society have primarily focused on trying to hold institutions accountable. What we are dealing with in this period are another social movement that is grounded in exclusion, not inclusion, and that social movement is also attempting to influence public institutions. What we need to do in this moment are three things. The first is we have to be an organization. It is why organizations like Working Families are so important. It is a multicultural, a multiracial space that brings people together to challenge inequality in our society. It does so by building power. If you are not an organization, your ability to respond to the white nationalist movement, either to its domestic terrorism or to its impact on policy, will be very limited. By being inside of important organizations like Working Families, what you get to do is to join with other folks of similar values, building power to change the conditions in our society. And changing inequality in our society is critically important. And this is the second thing that I tell people that we have to understand. I'll relate it in a story. About 2 August ago, there was a protest here in Portland, Oregon, by a group who calls themselves the Proud Boys and another organization called the Patriot Prayer. There was a young white nationalist who was being interviewed by someone with a video camera. And the person was saying to him, "Why are you here in Portland, Oregon? No one wants you here. Not the mayor, not community groups. Everyone has denounced you. Why are you here?" And the young white nationalist said, "Yes, I've heard that. No one wants us here. But the fact remains that the city of Portland is one of the few urban places in America where the Black population is shrinking by both whole number and by percentage." He then said to the person holding the camera, "You can say you don't want us here, but you're doing something we could never get away with. You are making the Black population of Portland, Oregon disappear." This second point is critically important. If we want to defeat the white nationalist movement, we have to build a real alternative that does not look like the present day inequality that exists in our society. If we do not address the inherent inequalities in our society, we will in no way be able to convince Americans that the way forward together is not through a trench of bigotry and hatred, but by lifting up the right for all of us to live, love, and work together. It is why being in political formations of shared values right now is so critical.
Thanks, Eric. Thank you. That's a lot to chew on, especially for the Working Families Party and the project that we're trying to build. And so if you could maybe, with this last question, since you're speaking with leaders all around the country, member leaders of the Working Families Party, if you could maybe share what you think that our distinct role in what you laid out might be. And then that'll be our last question. I might ask you one other thing, but yeah, just wanted to maybe in a few seconds share some insights for our members in particular.
Absolutely. I have studied and organized around this work for 3 decades, and I actually think the Working Families Party is uniquely positioned right now. There is so much cynicism in terms of politics and what does that mean in our lives right now, tangibly and measurably, that Working Families Party is a breath of fresh air. It is not focused on partisanship, but on shared values. And that's critically important. The white nationalist movement right now has focused on a specific constituency, right? And it is middle class and to working poor white folks. Now, let's be clear. It's not that people who are working class or working poor are more likely to join the white nationalist movement. It's simply that there are more working class and working poor people in America upon which to draw a constituency from. We need to compete for that constituency. And that means engaging at the local level. And it means doubling down on our values of race equity, gender equity, economic parity in our society, not running from them. So the one thing I would say in holding that in mind is that each member of the Working Families Party can be engaged in municipal politics, right? And making sure that right now we have the elected representation that represents the values of a multiracial democracy in America. That could be running for office, that could be volunteering for a campaign, that could be using your voice as advocacy. Everyone can do something. And the way to do it is through strengthening the unique vehicles, such as the Working Families Party. It is a critical vehicle in this time.
Thanks, Eric. That's a lot for all of us to ponder as we build a party in our respective states and communities. And just one last question. I think it's fitting, since you talked about the role of specifically of the party in building that multiracial alignment. Would you today join as a member of the Working Families Party?
You know what? I've never actually been asked. And yes, I would actually. I will join. And thank you for asking me. And I will make sure that I ask others as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric.
Thank you
for everything and all the work that you're doing. I really, really appreciate you.